I'm going to talk a little bit about the science, but I thought it might be more interesting for this crowd to learn about some of the processes that are involved, some of the more nuts and bolts sorts of things, with particular emphasis on how I've involved students in this. The project that Kevin mentioned is a collaboration between Washburn, University of Kansas, and the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. And so it's a very wide collaboration spanning everything from astrophysics to microbiology, which I think is very fun, although I'm not doing most of the microbiology, which is good. I'm not allowed in labs. Speaking of which, what I do is computational modeling. So I want to talk a little bit about how this works in terms of building models and running models and what you get out of them, and how I've involved students in that. The real advantage of doing computing, I think, is you can do all kinds of interesting things that one could never do in the lab or necessarily even observe very easily. So I'm interested in how the Earth is affected by high-energy radiation events, maybe solar flares, coronal mass ejections, supernovae, gamma ray bursts, soft gamma repeaters, possibly active galactic nuclei, things like that. So most of those are not things that we can get very much direct observation on in terms of their effects on the Earth. There is an exception to that. There was a soft gamma repeater which had a flare a few years ago and caused measurable ionization in the upper atmosphere. So there are at least one data point in terms of the direct impact on the Earth. But for the most part, this isn't something that I can go out and put a supernova next door and see what happens to the atmosphere, and I wouldn't really want to anyway. So building models and running them in various different scenarios is a fun way to explore that, and I think it's very useful. Of course, the computer has blessings and curses that come along with it. One of the great things is I can do something over and over and over again really fast. The downside is checking reality is sometimes a bit of a question mark. How realistic is this? Have I included everything which is important? Have I neglected something which is essential? Etc. So I'm going to talk a little more about that later on. Computing always involves a sort of feedback loop between various different areas of science. So observation and theory kind of go together. There's a sort of feedback between those two. Gamma ray bursts, for instance, are a nice example of that. They were observed serendipitously. No one was looking for them, no one was expecting them, and it took decades and a lot more observation to start to figure out what was going on. And now we have a reasonably good picture of at least one type and a sort of good picture of another type, and there's still a lot of work to do. So these obviously feed back and forth into each other. And then another component there, which kind of completes the loop, is the computing and doing models to test theoretical predictions to some extent, and then predict perhaps other observations that one might want to make. And of course, since I spend most of my time doing modeling, I'm interested in the results of that modeling, and in particular pretty graphs. I'll show you lots of graphs later. I actually have gotten a lot of press about this kind of stuff because it's death and destruction, fiery death from above, all these sorts of things. Oh, I didn't talk about my image here on the first page. NASA put this together for us up here for a press release a few years ago. And I really love it because it looks like the atmosphere is just on fire. There's a big explosion propagating around the planet. And if this object was actually that close, maybe that would happen, but it's really not quite that dramatic when we simulate a more realistic situation. I did do calculations when we were first starting this in terms of how close you'd have to put one of these things to just blow the atmosphere off entirely. It's ridiculously close, really happy. All right, so this is, of course, a feedback kind of loop, and all of these different areas are important. One of the things that I'm interested in doing is working with paleontologists and applying this to understanding changes in biodiversity in the fossil record. So this goes back into an entirely different theory box. So thinking about theory in terms of astrophysics is in play here, but a whole nother range of academic disciplines is involved as well, which I really get a kick out of because one day I'm reading astrophysics literature and the next day I'm reading a geology journal or a photobiology journal. I learned what limnology means and all of this. It's like oceanography, but for lakes. All right. So there's various things that I really like about doing computing, especially at a smaller university. So I have a 12 credit hour load every semester. I don't get to spend a huge amount of time on research. We do have a fair number of physics majors that some of them want to be involved and some of them don't really care, but those who do get involved, this is accessible in a lot of ways. One thing I like about the computing that I've done at least is it's pretty cheap. So I can do almost everything I want to do on a reasonably fast desktop computer. Now that's not entirely true for everything that I would like to do. I would like to start using more complex, more high resolution kinds of models which require a bit more computing power. Although we're fortunate enough to have a high-performance computing system cluster in our department, and we've started to move some of that over. But hardware-wise, I mean, unless you get really ambitious, or it's not terribly expensive if you're willing to wait. So I can run a lot of stuff in a reasonable amount of time without much cost. Software is another issue. So I do use some commercial software. I use IDL a lot. Partly for historical reasons because I built a lot of code in it as a grad student and couldn't bear to try to convert it all over to something else. But there's a lot of free software out there, which is great. And with a little bit of effort, one can generally make that work pretty well. I really like that I don't have to get up at 3 a.m. and make sure the vacuum pump is still working or whatever it happens to be. I've never been particularly great at experimental work. I tend to break things and stuff like that. So computer is reasonably safe. You let me next to a computer, I won't break anything probably. The ability to be very flexible is nice. So if I come up with something totally new I want to try to simulate, I can more or less do that pretty easily. I can modify my code, I can throw something new at it, and then see what happens. This also is nice for students because if they have something they're interested in, I probably can give them a route to do that without having to go out and buy a whole bunch of equipment and figure out how to use it and those sorts of things. Another really good advantage to this I have found is that I can easily collaborate with people all over the world. I'm working with a group in Switzerland right now, and they're helping me with some modeling. So it's very easy. I don't have to travel to a lab somewhere. I can easily email and send things back and forth via the internet, and it's very convenient. Okay, so a little bit more specific on what I've been doing with this modeling. And I'm going to focus on high-energy photon events, supernovae, gamma ray bursts. I've also worked on solar proton events, and I have one big rocks from space paper. I don't really like big rocks from space that much because it seems sort of inelegant. Photons are more interesting as far as I'm concerned. So I got into this in graduate school when I was doing cosmology and working on a project for a couple of years and had lots of bruises on my forehead from hitting my head against the table. And decided that I didn't want to do that anymore, so my advisor and I decided to start looking at gamma ray bursts and how they affect the Earth, and then it sort of ballooned from there. What we started with was, first of all, we need to have some idea of how to characterize the astrophysical event. And some of that feedback between theory and observation is, how can we describe this in a theoretical sort of way? So, of course, we write down an equation for it. And again, the nice thing about computing is I can just plug this into my computer and it can solve it or whatever I want to do with it reasonably easily. Another feature here is I can easily change parameters. Right? So there's spectra at two different energy regimes here that just slide over there. And I can run it at a new regime and takes a few hours, and I can look at the output and compare. So that's kind of handy. Let's see. Okay, so this is the starting point. But I want to look at the Earth, so I need to have some models that describe how the Earth works, and in particular the atmosphere. Right? That's what the radiation sees first, so that's where the effects are most important. And there's a couple of components here. So I start with a relatively simple model, which calculates the ionization in the atmosphere from these high-energy primaries. And this is actually reasonably simple. It's just a one-dimensional column of the atmosphere. There's equations or lookup tables that describe how the energy is deposited and how that creates ionization. So that's a fairly simple, really quick thing to do. And then plug this into a bigger, more complex atmospheric chemistry and dynamics model. And this is one that I inherited from the Goddard Space Flight Center, a particular group there that has done a lot of work on studying the ozone hole in Antarctica. So this was a robust, well-established, well-tested model, which I decided to see if I could break by throwing in way more than it had ever been designed to handle. And in fact, I did break it several times and figured out how to fix it, which took a lot of time. I actually found just some simple errors, like forgetting an end if or something like that, which no one had ever triggered before because no one had asked it to do quite what I was trying to get it to do. Which is a good lesson that these big, complex models, sometimes they're almost like studying a real physical system. You may not understand everything that goes on inside this thing. So that's kind of an interesting situation to be in. So I put this in as some ionization source, which takes part in the chemistry, and then I just let the thing run and see what happens. So along the way, I've had lots of students working in different areas, and some of the students who are really very capable have written chunks of code and run the model for different parameters and analyzed the output and written papers and whatnot. I would say that's more the exception than the rule. Usually it's a bit more modest. So taking something which is already pretty well established and making some minor changes. Okay, so I want to look at a different kind of spectrum. Let's code up that equation instead of this equation. Let's vary these parameters and now run the thing and then look at the output. And that's pretty accessible. And even a student who hasn't had much programming experience can take a piece of Fortran and go through and say, oh, okay, I need to change this value here and that value there, and then run it and look at the output. So there's a wide range of ability that I can span here. Data analysis. I can give a student a data file on the ozone profile in the atmosphere over this particular time period and just have them look at it and sort of poke around and see what interesting things might pop out. And that involves learning how to maybe use some data analysis software, just asking interesting questions. Like for instance, one of the counterintuitive things for this result is, well, first of all, the main effect is you deplete ozone in the stratosphere. But as a consequence of that, which seems a little counterintuitive, you actually produce ozone at lower levels. And if you don't already know, ozone is a pollutant when we're talking about people breathing it. It's actually quite bad for you. So one of the things that I actually haven't looked at yet, but really want to coerce a student into doing, is just looking at ground level values and comparing that to measured data. If there's a ozone warning, what does that mean in terms of volume, number, density of ozone, or something like that, and just do some comparison. So that would be pretty easy to do in general. Okay, so one of the advantages is I've got this huge pile of data, and I can just start sorting through it and see what kinds of things look interesting. But one of the problems with that is I have to figure out what's real and what's not. Right? Anytime there's, and I think this is true for any sort of observational or experimental work as well, but with a model it's maybe particularly worse, because I might get something that seems reasonable, but maybe it's not, because some of the results that are real are counterintuitive. So looking at that takes some practice. That's one of the downsides of having students work on this, because they tend to believe whatever comes out of the computer. And I had a bit of a problem with that with one of the students recently, that I wasn't paying very close attention to, and then we got to sort of the end of the project, and I realized, oh, this is all wrong. And so we're going to have to go back and redo that, because he just hadn't picked up on the fact that the results were really not realistic. And that's something that comes with practice and experience to a large extent. So, some pretty graphs, as promised. One of the things that I had to get used to was picking out various different parameter spaces to explore and then how best to represent those, because I'm dealing with a large collection of data. This is a two-dimensional model as opposed to a three-dimensional model. So I've got altitude and latitude, and then I've got time, and then I've got all these chemical constituents and dynamics, parameters, and various different kinds of things. So this is the ionization in the atmosphere from the gamma ray burst. And it's concentrated at a particular altitude, which has to do with the way the atmosphere absorbs the energy and the dependence of pressure with altitude and so on. And so that's kind of my input. And then I get out this production of nitrogen oxides here. And it looks brown for a reason, so choosing your color scheme is important. Right? Actually, it turns out it is kind of important choosing your color scheme. For various reasons, but actually I wrote a paper yesterday which I was fuming at because their color scheme was horrible and I couldn't understand what their data represented. So it's actually a pretty good lesson for students to say, you need to make this more clear, otherwise people reading it won't know what you're talking about. Why is it brown? Well, because nitrogen dioxide absorbs very strongly and visible, and so you get this sort of brownish haze when you produce that in the atmosphere. And that's the column density. So this is an atmosphere or an altitude profile going up through the atmosphere. And this is a column density of the latitude and time. So this is like a global sort of map. So producing these nitrogen oxides depletes the ozone. And as I said, where the red here is this depletion, there's actually production below that. And that kind of mitigates the effects to some extent. There's a column density of ozone here and then a depletion. One of the things that I spend a lot of time figuring out is this little spike right here, this little peak. And you see there's a positive value where almost everything is negative. That is, the ozone is depleted over essentially the whole world, except for this little spike right here, which is fairly short-lived and very anomalous. So I had to figure out, did I break the code? Right? Did I make the model do something unphysical? Or is there something real going on here? And eventually I convinced myself and other people who knew even more about the chemistry and physics that yes, this is real. This is actually real. It's just something that is not normally seen because the situation I'm looking at here is so extreme. Right? It's so much beyond what we normally would be seeing in the atmosphere that it's a whole different regime. No one's really understood before. And we convinced ourselves it was right by looking at the details, the very fine details of what was going on with the chemistry in various different places and over different time scales. Okay, and there's so much parameter space I can explore with these kinds of problems, and I have yet to exhaust the parameter space exploration. So these are all for an event that occurs right over the equator. But I thought, well, put it somewhere else because a gamma ray burst in particular is very point source. It's very brief, seconds, tens of seconds at most, so it can be put in right over a particular location. So I've got various different locations here and then different time periods because the atmospheric chemistry as well as the transport, the dynamics, depends very heavily on seasonality. So you'll see this kind of back and forth trade-off, for instance, in these where it's centrally located, where the sun is up in the poles and then it's down and so on. So looking at these different parameters can give some interesting results in terms of, well, if you hit the planet from a polar region, you only get depletion in that polar region, which is great if you live in the other hemisphere. But if you hit it in the middle, it sort of distributes out. More extreme event or more extreme results for that kind of event, and so on. So these kinds of plots are great, but they get very busy after a while. So learning how to resolve that down to something which is simple but still represents an interesting result is important. So this is a global average, taking one of these graphs and just averaging the latitude in this case. you get this nice, simple plot. And these kinds of plots have been very useful for me because I can get a sort of general intensity by measuring. Okay, so it's a 35% global average completion versus a 10% or a 5%. I can say this is an extreme event, this is sort of a medium one, this is no big deal, just by that one kind of number. There was a couple of other interesting results that we got out. And the goal here was to try and generalize. So there's lots and lots of different kinds of events that one might want to consider, and in particular durations. So a short GRB has a duration of a fraction of a second, a tenth of a second or so. And that's a big difference from a long GRB, which is 10 seconds, and even a bigger difference from a supernova, which might last for a year. Right? The radiation can be a very long-lived kind of thing, although it's less intense. So we wanted to look at how the duration affected the results. We took this column depletion for the global average and just ran a whole bunch of scenarios with different durations, holding the energy constant, so that was important, the total energy constant, but just vary that one time parameter. And what we found is the maximum, or minimum, if you like, is about the same. So I can blast the atmosphere for a tenth of a second, or I can dribble it out for a year, and you get essentially the same result overall. Now, the timing is different, right? It takes longer or it happens more rapidly. This is really handy because now I can just say, well, here's an event with a particular energy, and I don't care how long it lasts because you get roughly the same result. If all I'm looking for is a general sort of, is this bad or not so bad? The other thing we found is that the energy of the primaries is actually quite important. So the numbers here represent the place where I put the turnover on this spectrum. So this is what we would call a harder spectrum. It's got more of a high energy, photons in this case, versus a softer spectrum. And that hardness value matters quite a bit. So the same kind of thing here, the total energies remains constant between these different parameter values. But as I go down, it gets more and more intense. Of course, there's some limiting regime here, right? So I can only deplete so much. If I reach 100%, it goes over more, I can't get more to it. That's one of the limits. Okay, so some of the lessons that I hope students take away from this kind of work. There's a lot of trade-offs in doing any kind of science. In particular, in doing computational science. So my two-dimensional model of the atmosphere is limited. It doesn't include zonal transport, which may be important for some things I want to look at, like temperature changes. But it's not important for something like ozone, it turns out, because the mixing is so rapid in that direction. It doesn't really matter how many scale I'm looking at. So choosing complexity levels is really important. Deciding, do I want to look more at this value or that one? Do I have enough physics and chemistry in to really answer the questions I want to ask more or less accurately? How accurate do I want to be? Increasing my precision or accuracy requires more data. And as I have learned, the more observational data one uses, the more cursing one emits. Maybe that's just me. But I've had to work with all kinds of nasty sorts of data recently with oceanography and microbiology and things like this. And probably it's just that I wasn't familiar with it. That's actually made me benefit because I've learned to work with lots of different kinds of data sets. Okay, so the worth it question is a big one. Is it really worth the extra work it takes to increase that accuracy a little bit more? Where are my uncertainties? Right? If I have a big uncertainty at the very beginning and I don't really know how energetic this thing is, then it's probably not worth doing the very fine details over here on the other end. Okay, those uncertainties are something that's important for students to get to understand. And then how to deal with those. Probably the most important thing that I picked up when I was first working on this as a graduate student was simply to get a handle on those uncertainties. How do I know if the changes I'm producing are really going to break my model or not? So one of the ways I did that was work with simpler models. So my model doesn't include this particular reaction, I'm going to use a simpler one in some sense that includes that reaction and see how those compare. And then simply saying, well, here's some possible limitations, and I don't know exactly how that affects it, so take what you will from that. In terms of sort of practical stuff, the students who have worked on this with me have usually come to me with very little to no computing experience. So they get to learn command line Linux, they get to learn some Fortran programming, they might learn some shell scripting, whatever it is that they happen to want to do or need to do. They learn how to use different data analysis packages. Some of them have used Excel or MATLAB or Mathematica or RDL and various different kinds of programs. And then I usually try to have my students present this in some way. We have every spring a student research forum on campus. And if a student has been doing research with me, I strongly encourage them to put together a poster or a talk. And I found that that's really instructive. One of my students did really good work and could not write to save his life. His spelling and grammar was horrible. So we spent a lot of time just doing English. He'd send me a draft and say, okay, that's great. Now, you need to go back and use your spell check. You know? So that was just a very practical thing that he probably should have gotten elsewhere, but for whatever reason, I was the one that helped him with that. Learning how to visualize well. I worked with a student recently, and we just played around with various different ways to visualize some of the data he had produced. And that's kind of fun, because you can just see what you've got in different ways and get feedback. When we go to talk about this with, particularly at this research symposium, the undergraduate research symposium, most of the people have no idea what we're talking about. So if we have nice, clear kinds of presentation, they're going to get more out of that, and sometimes we get feedback like, well, I don't understand that graph, that doesn't make sense, so next time we'll change it a bit. Okay, and all of this involves a lot of collaboration. I've been reasonably successful at a lot of this work because it's involved a lot of collaborative effort. I work with people at NASA, I work with people from Illinois and KU and others at Washburn and so on. So having that broad collaboration has been really important. Students particularly learn that there's a lot of frustration involved in doing research, and that's, I'm sure, true for any project that one might want to consider, but it's an important lesson, I think. And learning how to get past that, learning how to take a dead end and make something productive out of it is particularly important. Yeah, so I think that's about it, and I hope I'm early enough to have already to ask some questions if you have. Mm-hmm.
So your research, I mean, what you do includes two components. Looking at how the gamma rays burst and cosmic affects the Earth by looking at the atmospheric composition, how it changes. Mm-hmm. And the other one you said was the plankton and the things in the ground. So
right.
I didn't see anything about that part. I guess.
Yeah.
I'd like to know a little bit more.
Sure.
The geology part.
Yeah. Let me pull up another talk here which has more on that. So I didn't want to go too long on this. So what I'm doing most recently is focusing more on the details. So what I started out with was a very simple sort of, here's a really simple one-dimensional atmosphere with the ozone results plugged in, and let's see how we use these effectively. And that's a nice first approximation, right? And then we combine that with a DNA damage weighting function, which gives you graphs like this. And this is another nice first approximation. DNA damage is pretty well studied. You know, you can take DNA and irradiate it in the lab, and it's relatively easy to do. I hear, I'm not a microbiologist, but there's lots of that in the literature. So combining those two fairly simple approaches was a good first start and actually gave us some really interesting results that we could carry forward and look at more details, because what you see here is no matter where I put the event and no matter when it occurs, the longest lasting significant biological damage is right about in the middle in terms of latitude. So the biggest depletion happens around poles, and there's lots of reasons for that. But the sun angle and the depletion combination actually is most intense right in those sort of middle latitudes there for any kind of case you want to look at. That was helpful because this was a relatively simple thing to do, but now I can drill down to the details and not look at the whole globe, but focus in on that particular location. So improving on that is what I've been working on recently. And there's two components. One is looking in more detail at the transfer of the radiation through the atmosphere, because it turns out that there's more than just one absorbing constituent, and there's aerosols that scatter and things like that. And then combining that with new and better functions that define the biological component. So my collaborator at the Smithsonian is actually measuring and getting close to finishing that work, the impact on phytoplankton, a couple of particular species that are important around those latitudes that we're zooming in on. And so I'm incorporating his results into more detailed modeling that goes now, instead of just to the surface, into the water column, and combining that in various different ways.
Thank you.
Sure.
You said you've been running it on a single computer and played around with moving, I guess, the cluster. Do you use any kind of parallelization for graphics card implementation or anything on the single computer, or are you just using the main single computer?
I haven't, yeah. One reason for that is the model I inherited started as a baby in the 80s and continually progressed from there. And so there's some very old code in it which I really don't want to redo as parallelized.
Right. Yeah.
And it's been fast enough that it hasn't there hasn't been much incentive to do it. Now the newer model that I'm wanting to use is a three-dimensional general circulation model, and it's parallelized. And actually, a student has been working for the last couple of years getting that working on our cluster. That's a much more complicated problem.
Because of in-body coding, that's the direction they're all going.
Right, right. And I should mention that I did use some high-performance computing time at National Center for Supercomputing Applications. Some of what we did required much more time, and that was helpful. It's actually relatively easy to get time on those computers, unless you want a huge chunk of it. You can write an initial startup grant, which is 10,000 hours or something like that. It's actually pretty significant for very little amount of work. Nice. Yeah.
Getting students to understand the significance of models is actually fairly difficult, and I'm a high school teacher, so I would be trying to do the foundational steps before they get to you guys.
Right.
Are there relatively simplistic models out there that we could use as training platforms for students, where they could see, look, if I plug in this, out comes this?
One that I know of is called EdGCM, EdGCM, and it's a general circulation climate model, but it's designed to be run on a desktop, and it's geared towards education. So it used to be free, but last time I looked, I think they're charging for it now, unfortunately. But it is designed to do exactly that. So let's take a carbon dioxide emission scenario, plug it in, and then look at the temperatures. So it's using a sophisticated model, but in a simplified way.
Yeah.
Let's thank our speaker.